All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Gorjan Nikolik. I'm from Rabobank Group. Just before I kick off, a couple of words on who we are. You may know Rabobank is a global lender in the food and agriculture industry. We were founded by farmers 120 years ago, and since then have always been loyal to the agriculture industry. And as this figure here shows, Rabobank has grown across the world and really financing farmers and food production pretty much in every corner. And as such, we also are very active in aquaculture, fisheries, and seafood, really financing the sector and throughout its whole value chain and across the world. And this is the industry that I follow. I've been following this since 2005. So now for a good 15 years. So I've singled out the salmon industry, the shrimp sector, and I will briefly touch upon the freshwater species, Tilapia and Pangasius. I think we won't have time for fish meal and fish oil. Maybe we can cover that next time. So I hope to wrap it up in 40 minutes, but let's see how it goes, right? So let's start with salmon. And this sector, as you know, it's dominated by two players, Norway and Chile. And my main story here is that the two countries are experiencing Corona in two very different ways. But let's start with the details and I'll go through it. Maybe I should mention we are a bank, and as such, what we follow is typically market dynamics, prices, profitability, and impact of Corona on the companies itself. So that's the main topic of our discussion. So let's talk about salmon. Let's see the starting point before Corona hit. So if you remember back in 2016, we had this algae bloom that happened in Chile that created the jump in the price and the long-term high price that was supported by low supply growth. So we've been in this high price point for both Norway and Chile for 5 years or 4.5 years, doing really well until basically Corona came. And this is the price correction we're having, a little bit more for the Chileans than the Norwegians, but I'll get into some detail about how each one is performing. So if you look at the delta, supply delta, this is one of the most important let's say figures we look at in the salmon industry is what will supply growth be per year. Now it's a growth sector, of course, but this type of supply growth, low single digits, this would typically create a very high price scenario. And this is basically what's been supporting the price early on before Corona hit. This contraction was the algae bloom that created the high price point. This sort of maintained it, but I have to say that due to Corona, the companies have managed to take some action to slightly reduce the supply growth. So it became a little tighter than it already was. It was already quite tight. And notice here that 2021 is especially tight year. So this will be price supporting. Now, how is it going per country? This is the Norwegians. They are the leading country in the sector, and the expectation for 2020 is 1% growth. So really nothing special here, almost flat, which should help them with price support. Now the Chileans, they had a pretty strong growth in the past, a strong year in 2020, but this is the key point to watch. 2021 is a pretty significant contraction in Chile, and this should be the turning point when prices change and as the market rebalances towards a lower demand level. For the rest, the other countries are pretty steady. So the main driver to watch really is Chile changing this. Norway recovering nicely. Let's look at Norway a little bit first. So this is a picture of the Norwegian exports and the Norwegian prices this year, as presented by Fishpool on their weekly report. And what you see that basically prices for Norwegian products were a little bit lower in April and May, but they recovered after that. And since then, they're tracking slightly below 2019. Now, 2019 was a very high price year. So to have this experience is really not that bad. You know, going down in a typical seasonal down cycle, but nothing really worrisome here. Typical cost levels are well below this in Norway, so nobody is at the moment making any losses at all. And if you look at exports per week, they're kind of similar to last year, a bit below now. It's easier to see the exports from Norway if you look at it on a monthly basis and compare it to how it has been in previous years. Well, what you notice is that we are now at 0% growth, actually slightly below 2019, but we're well ahead most other years. So this is really not a very bad year for Norway. They had a small decline in May and June as they were reshuffling exports from one region that was declining, let's say like Italy or China earlier in the year, to some better regions. But overall, a very good performance. And this requires some explanation. The point that the reason why Norway has been so good from a demand side is that they sell over 80% to Europe. And in Europe, we consume salmon to a large extent at retail. So when Corona hit, of course, we lost some of the demand or most of the demand at food service, but nearly all of that has been made up with increased demand at food retail. People still want to eat salmon. They want to treat themselves at home. It's an easy to produce product. It's certainly the very large European processing industry creates many value-added and interesting products to be used and to be cooked at home. So overall, I would say Norway doing exceptionally well. I would even say the Norwegian producers are sort of the safe haven when it comes to food production in Corona. If you look forward a bit, how will they perform for the rest of the year? There's also not huge surprises there. I have two different sources about the biomass in the sea that's remaining for this year. So we got between 1% and 5%, so nothing crazy there. Now let's switch to Chile. So Chile is quite a different story. It's a story of first a country which is still increasing export this year, but also look at the countries that they export to. So USA is the #1, then it's Japan, then Latin America, then Asia, without Japan, others, and these other two are too small. These countries here, you know, Latin America and certainly the US, so 2 out of the top 3 are some of the most hard-hit countries with Corona. And still, the Chileans managed to deliver 8% growth in US, 10% growth in Japan, and this is where they really had to have lower supply. This is in Latin America, and you know now Brazil, you know, especially the Corona is very heavy hit. And these countries, especially US and Latin America, salmon is consumed here at food service level. So the contraction in demand is really quite significant. One of the actions they're doing is to slightly export a bit to the EU, but it's a small market for them. The growth is significant, 30%, but from a small base. So what is happening on the price points of this exporter? This is the US fresh fillet delivered in Miami from Chile. This is what happened in 2020. It's a really dramatic fall. We have the first correction coming during the first outbreak, remember New York and that region. Then a little bit of optimism, and then most likely the second wave coming in. Now, Chileans have done really well in terms of cost in the last couple of years, but still, I would say their cost is somewhere between, I guess, 4.5, somewhere in that region is the cost level for this type of product delivered in Miami. So if you're, you know, if this is the price point, this is really a very difficult time for the Chilean industry. Another interesting point to have a look is what the Americans are importing. Actually, in the Corona time, the Americans so far, year-to-date May, have consumed almost the same amount of salmon, 0.27% less import, and there is no domestic production. So, but there's been a shift from the whole fish, see fresh Atlantic whole, frozen whole, all declining, and towards the fillets. This is to do with the shift from food service to retail. Retail typically buys this type of product, while food service buys these. So interesting to see that the Americans are, in fact, consuming the same amount of salmon, but at a different, in a different form, in a different distribution point. Speaking of retail, Berry is a service that we subscribe to from the US, and they track the average retail prices for salmon. And look how low it has been since May. And then there's another dip here in mid-July. So I would say this kind of low salmon price point at retail should be inducive of a growing retail consumption of this product. And in fact, some people are being optimistic here, saying that, you know, this is great because potentially even after when Corona is over and food service starts to return, a lot of people have tried salmon at home and they're used to buying it at this lower price point. So it might be inducive for the long-term demand curve in the US. So trying to wrap it up on salmon and look a little bit further into the future, we're lucky in the salmon industry to have a futures curve. And this is the Oslo futures curve. And I observed this one on a daily basis. So I took a couple of snapshots, one in March, one in April, and one later in July. And you saw the curve shifting downwards throughout really the peak of the pandemic, going from 60, 70 down to 50, and it shifted down to 50 NOK. But this uptick is really prevalent. Constantly, the industry is thinking that there will be a recovery somewhere around the second part of 2020 and even 2021. And this connects to some of the things that I said of the declining supply, especially from Chile, because they put a lot less smolt in the first half of 2020. And then that lower level of smolt translates into a contraction of Chilean supply in 2021. And that, together with low Norwegian supply, is supporting this price level. I actually printed the latest contracts for futures contracts, and this is interesting to see that you can now get a contract in Oslo for 63 NOK for Q1, 64 NOK for Q2 in 2021. These are pretty high prices, so we're back to high price point. An important point to mention here is that this assumes a NOK to euro, a very low Norwegian exchange rate. I have to say that for the Norwegians, the low Norwegian exchange rate has been a blessing, since they were able to sell salmon at a very low price in euro, but a pretty good price in NOK. So assuming that this remains the same, the NOK euro exchange rate, it still remains low, then we can see this kind of price point, so a real recovery, at least for Norway. And you know, typically this results in within a couple of months in a global high price point. So at least in salmon, we're expecting a return to the high price point somewhere in 2021, at least probably in the early part. So it's a good sector that has done very well for a long time. It will have a difficult time for now, especially in non-European regions, but it should all come back fairly soon. Looking further long term, there are major technological changes that are occurring that will eventually lead to a supply curve that is expanding further. And what we're seeing is a lot of projects on the land-based side. There are three types of land-based project: the full recirculating aquaculture style of Atlantic Sapphire in Miami, that will deliver potentially a few thousand tons this year, but much more in the future. Then you have the post-smolt strategy that many of the Norwegian companies are doing, basically bringing some production on land. And then the most recently, we heard a lot about a new flow-through technology to produce salmon on land in Norway, but then without license constraints. So I think these together with a number of offshore projects, I would say within the next 5 years, we should see more and more salmon coming from alternative sources, particularly the post-smolt strategy is already going to lead to more supply in the next 1 or 2 years. So our view is that not too long from now, let's say 5, 6 years, we should say supply growth growing a little bit better than the single digits that we've seen so far. And that will create somewhat lower prices than we see at the moment. So that's our near, midterm, and long-term view on the salmon sector. We remain very optimistic on this industry and its profitability. So I'm going to switch now to shrimp. The shrimp sector is really totally different than salmon. Not only is it a tropical industry with a fragmented farming base, but it also has a very different supply demand balance. This is the price of exports from Thailand and the Urner-Barry import price index. And you see that really from this high point, which is the EMS crisis, we're having almost a continuous decline in the price. This is supported by really strong supply growth. Unlike salmon and shrimp, we have almost no real limitation to supply growth. It's only really price constraint. So on the back of this, we're going into Corona, a market that was already in oversupply. Actually, I went to a couple of conferences just before Corona. So I spoke on this one. It was in Chennai, in Goa, in November 2019. And my colleagues went to the NFI in Miami in January. And both conferences, there's a lot of optimism about the supply of shrimp in 2020. This is just before Corona. So Indians were talking about 7 to 10% growth. Vietnam was very optimistic, 13 to 17. Actually, this was 9 to 6% was the growth expected in Ecuador after years of very good double-digit growth. So really, these big players were planning on growing quite substantially. Now you imagine this sort of supply dynamic and then being hit immediately by a very sharp decline in the demand. The moment that Chinese, Lunar New Year happened exactly at the time when the Chinese industry, the Chinese industry was locked in by Corona. So what happened with the prices? We have a good view in the US prices. Basically, throughout the first 4 or 5 months, we saw product looking to find a market in US or Europe as it couldn't find buyers in China. And that created this high price correction. In fact, already this one here, 2018 and 2019, these are not high price years, right? This actually was a fairly low price year, 2019, and then 2020 is really well below this. And again, you can see the double dip. See one dip and then a sort of an improvement and then another lockdown, or let's say another Corona wave in the US. Interestingly enough, if you see what the Americans were buying, I want to point out first at this point that year-to-date May, they're still up 39%. 3.9%. That's because they bought a lot of product in January, February, and March, hoping to load up for the rest of the year. But then they found out that in May, their own market is locked out. So they stopped buying. So this was the sharpest decline in American buying we've ever seen. Basically 30% less than the market before. And I heard that it was also tough in the next couple of months. This is how it impacted the different, this is the US market, but it's a good bellwether for the world to a certain extent. So you saw India, that typically is the main supplier to the United States, really dominant, 38%, followed by Indonesia and Ecuador. They went down by 57% in May, in the month of May, and that was to do with both weak prices in the U.S., but also some issues with delivering the peeled product that typically India delivers to the US. So it's a very red line here. The only country that did very well in May was still Indonesia. Look, 24% growth. That has to do with a very strong processing sector and really good performance of Indonesia. But we'll talk about this later. So certainly a very difficult market with a lot of supply chasing few buyers at this point. This is the most recent information I got from the June trade into the US. And actually Indonesia overtook India for the first time, I think, in 5 years as the largest exporter to the US, with still a very big growth, and India still a very big decline. And you see Ecuador actually coming in with 55% more product. That's because Ecuador has a lot of issues with selling a huge volume in this period, trying to find a market in the US. So that's, let's say, let's switch to Ecuador now. So Ecuador is actually pretty, I would say, the most interesting story in this first half of the year. So if any one of you has followed shrimp for any period of time, you'll know that Ecuador is the success story of the shrimp sector for the last, probably for the last decade. And at least for 7 or 8 years, we've seen this type of growth rate. Double digit, 16, 17% growth rate. And this is the year-to-date figures May. And basically until May, they continued this huge growth rate. And this growth rate, this momentum that they've built, is largely due to their success in China. If you see where they're exporting, see from the 600,000 tons, 400 plus are going to China. So 2/3 are going to China. And especially until May, they were incredibly successful in China. 82% volume growth, value 74%. So very, very successful in China until May. For 5 or 6 years, Ecuador has done really great work in China, selling this extensive product. But as you know, the Chinese found corona on the outside of the packaging, and 3 companies were banned, but many others, because they didn't want to be seen liable. There would be any corona. They themselves then stopped exporting to China. And since May, there was a crash of exports to China. So this is the Ecuadorian exports in May, June, and July. Basically, you see they're kind of slightly up in the rest of the world, but China, which was their main market, really disappeared. It disappeared in 2 months. And this is creating a very unsettled global market. Now, there's a lot of speculation as to why this is happening. I spoke to so many people, and there's all kinds of wild ideas. Some were saying China is doing this because they want to protect their own shrimp sector, because Ecuador is so dominant and it's such a competitive product that the Chinese want to protect their own sector. Maybe that's the reason. Others had even more sinister stories. They said, oh, they're negotiating some contracts, or who knows what other sinister game it was. I don't really believe these. I spoke to our office in China, and they said, well, the government in China has given the orders to take corona super seriously, and has told all the local governments and institutions to take no chances whatsoever. So they're testing everything and anything. And, sometimes there could be a false positive, like now. They find a little bit of RNA of corona on one package of 240 packages. Who knows where it came from? And then there's this huge overreaction because no one wants to take a chance. Yes, the WHO and the FDA say you cannot really get corona from food because it's a respiratory disease. But then again, no one can with certainty guarantee that it isn't possible. It has not happened, but it's not possible to guarantee that it cannot happen. So to reduce all risk, the Chinese are reacting like this. And the big casualty to that so far has been Ecuador, and later all the shrimp prices. So it creates a very unsettled market. The good news is that this morning I heard that this situation is unraveling, and that the main banned companies are not banned anymore. But I think it's still going to be months before this recovers, simply because there is also a question of confidence from the consumers now. And also, you're still liable that if China finds a little speck of corona on your product somehow, and maybe it was introduced locally, then it's still your fault. So this is what happened to prices. I mean, Ecuador really suffered the sharpest price decline. This is the already from Chinese New Year coming down. Then there was some hope that Americans and Europeans could buy the product. Then it went down again. Don't look at this blue one. This is a large shrimp, but the smaller shrimp, I mean, look, it's really coming down. It's almost 40% down for some of these products. Definitely below cost now. So this is going to create a supply reaction in Ecuador for sure. But it takes time, 2, 3, 4 months before a supply reaction can be made. So let's switch to the other big supplier, India. And the first thing you notice, look at this price difference. It's pretty much flat. Indian prices have not corrected as much as Ecuadorian. There was a temporary dip here, and this has to do with a couple of reasons. First, India is not growing. It's declining in the market, so it's easier to maintain the price. Secondly, the government set minimum prices. So there's some price guarantees. And I think third and most important, India sells a highly processed product that goes into retail. And retail, as we know, was a lot less impacted than food service. So this is a very different story when it comes to India. Here is the Indian supply dynamic so far. So they were growing still in January and February. It took a while to respond, but look, already in March, there are declines. The interesting thing is that they really switched away from the US in March and April. And this is by far their core market. They grew in January and February, but as the prices in the US fell, and as they struggled with some processing facilities, as they sell mostly a peeled product, this came down sharply. But they quickly pivoted towards China, where you remember March and April, the market was doing much better in China, and then they sent product there to exploit a slightly better market than really competing with Ecuador even more. The most recent data shows that once again there is still a decline in June, 9%, but they're stabilizing towards the US, only 1%. Compared to last year, now they're even moving away from China as prices there have fallen. So I would say very unsettled market. Let's round off some of these shrimp stories that I'm actually quite behind time. I'm sorry about that. This is the story about Southeast Asia, and it was presented by CP Foods. And basically they said that the one big winner here is Vietnam. It's a country. This is including monodon, by the way. So Vietnam really had a strong expectation for 2020 already, but now they're flat. But their impact of Corona has been relatively minimal. The others they expect some of the other producers to come down somewhat, and overall the whole region about 10% due to Corona. Now let's go some of them one by one. This is Vietnam. Now, if you don't look at the really big shrimp, again, the smaller and more common shrimp are not really down in price. They're more or less flat for the year. And this is what the Vietnamese exports have done in Jan to May. Actually, really well. You notice that they're 2.3% up in value, which is great. And they're very balanced between the four big importing regions: Japan, US, China, EU. So they're really balanced across all of them, and just slightly shifting towards the EU in this period, to the US in this period. And certainly, what I've heard about the industry is that the impact of Corona on processing is very limited. There's very few outbreaks in Vietnam. The government has been supportive, and the country has done well in general. So really a different story than, for example, India, where there's a lot of impact from Corona also on processing and on farming. And finally, Indonesia. So we really expected a difficult year for Indonesia, based on what people said in 2019, but they were really surprised in the first quarter. And this has to do with the very developed Indian processing sector and focused on the US. So you remember the US bought a lot of product until April, and Indonesia even overtook India as an exporter. And that really has to do with the strength of the processing sector delivering a product to retail. So that's why they did so well. Most likely, if the predictions of others are correct, the second half will not be quite as good. This is the Indonesian performance, doing well. This is when the US stopped buying, but they've really recovered with retail demand in the US pushing prices back, and also China buying now also from. So really surprising how good they have done this year. So to end this whole story, we've ended up with countries doing very different in this environment. And we've ended up with very strange differences in the price. If you look at a standard product, not processed, now Ecuador is by far the cheapest, or let's say the lowest cost product, which is interesting since Ecuador probably has a premium at retail point. And as I said throughout the presentation, this has to do with the market they supply and the product that's not processed, which is focused on food service. So it will take some time for this market to settle, for arbitrage to make more similar pricing. And those countries that have a very processed product and premiums, in Thailand, higher priced product, Indonesia also higher priced product. So you will see product from Ecuador going into the markets of these other countries until a somewhat more of an equilibrium is created. And also, I do expect some decline in supply in the second half of many players, including Ecuador. And long term, I mean, just like every difficult period, you see that the least efficient companies and farmers in every country will leave the market, especially in the second half of the year. And in shrimp, efficiency to a large extent, and maybe not regarding Ecuador, but certainly in most other countries, if you have more intensive system, more professional, if the system is more closed, less impact from the environment, if you're using the best technology like nursery, advanced nurseries, genetics, reservoir ponds, these are the companies and the farmers that will survive this period and grow, and while others will exit. So in this way, we will see a continuation of a long-term trend that was started with EMS of professionalization and intensification of the shrimp sector. So I don't know. I'm gonna run over time a little, but I'll just finish with the freshwater fish. Then the last chapter. Maybe we tried to do a little bit too much in this webinar. So freshwater fish is a sector that, of course, is mostly known for tilapia and pangasius. And from a trade perspective, it's been sort of flat for a couple of years. Flat in exports, flat in imports, of course, is the same, but also flat in value. And you don't really want to see that. But the interesting point is look at Europe and China changing position. Back in 2012, 2013, the importer is the US and Europe. And look at this blue line sort of coming up and then becoming the main importer. That's very interesting to see that China now is actually the #1 importer of freshwater fish when they themselves are also the second exporter. So they are really both, let's say, an importer and an exporter of freshwater species, though this is tilapia and this is pangasius that they import. This is what has happened in the US again. This is still a very important importer, and we have good data for it. So throughout the last, let's say, couple of years, you've seen a competition between Pangasius and Tilapia. And Pangasius had a big market share in 2018, but declining throughout this period, especially very hard year for 2019 for Pangasius, but also for Tilapia. Overall, this sector has lost 11% in value and has gained 11% or 12% in volume. Yeah, this is what you don't want to see. Basically, an oversupply. It's funny. This is a classic economics, right? You put this much volume and you get that much price down. So clearly, the market cannot absorb any additional volume, and especially the prices for Pangasius have fallen. That's actually a long story, but this is what happened in typically a pretty stable market. You see Tilapia prices flat, very surprisingly, because there was a lot of taxes going on here. But these are the offer prices that they've managed to, that are present in the US market. But Pangasius, which was slapped by a lot of red tape, they experienced this huge price spike, and obviously volume dropped tremendously during this period. But then as the red tape issues were solved, you see them again undercutting Tilapia. So I expect that Pangasius will become again bigger and bigger into the US, especially since now we know that Tilapia was no longer exempt from the tariff. So the 25% tariff is back in the US. So expect that Pangasius will become stronger and stronger in the US. And this is the Chinese imports. They too have this interesting taste for Pangasius. A couple of years ago, we always said, like, why would China ever buy Pangasius? They have Tilapia and they don't really buy fillet. It's not in their nature, but different reasons, you know, modern consumers, African swine fever, other things. Pangasius has been a runaway success in the Chinese market. And basically year to date, volume 40% up. This is unfortunately only data based on 2 months because we don't have the data for these other 2 months. But I do think that as this year was a huge growth, I expect 2020 to also be a significant growth for this sector. So, you know, it's a very difficult sector to understand where it's going, but that's why I try to create a historical dynamic of what is happening in freshwater species and what our current opinion is, why we think that China now is going to be the next battleground and where will be the most oversupply of whitefish. So the story begins like this: is China first targeted the US with a frozen tilapia fillet product, and well, they did well for a while, but they were selling their rejected tilapia products in China in the domestic market, often below cost, but reducing their own brand. When they started to have the loose competitiveness in the US due to, you know, Trump and China and tariffs, etc., they focus on the domestic market, basically focusing on China. Now let's follow the path of Pangasius. They first focused in Europe. They flooded the European market with low-cost Pangasius fillets, but remember there was that German video that came out and had, well, wrong or right, destroyed the image of Pangasius. So what they did is that they refocused on the US and acquired a major market share. But now that there are problems in the US market too, with anti-dumping and red tape and tough competition with China, what do? They focus on China. So now China becomes, let's say, the next battleground, and I think this will be where, again, we will see oversupply. So overall, I think as an exporter, it's very difficult to make money in this sector. In our view, the market for freshwater fish is the local for local market. Exporters are going to have a difficult time. Where we see a lot of growth and actually some money being made is in places like Egypt, Bangladesh, India, local for local with Pangasius. Nigeria has been a great market. Brazil, it's really a huge growth. So in many places in the developing world, you have a fresh, whole fish produced locally, sold locally on wet markets. And frankly, this has really not been impacted by Corona at this point. It's doing well. We hear fantastic stories about sub-Saharan Africa too. And there's less competition from a Chinese, really low-cost Chinese product. So I think that was it. That was the end of my presentation.